Parents take sister on vacation instead of me, and she ends up ruining it all. My folks took my sister on a vacation instead of me. Later, she wrecked the family trip and ended up in jail. Now they finally see her for who she really is. I'm Jake, 23, and I've got a younger sister, Molly, 18, who I swear is the devil in disguise. I've spent years trying to get my parents to see the truth, but they never believed me, until now. For context, my parents and I always had a bit of a rocky relationship, mostly because of Molly. My parents absolutely adored her because my mom had a miscarriage and lost the baby, which messed her up pretty bad. Molly came along a few years later and was treated like a miracle, a beacon of hope that healed their pain. They showered her with attention and affection, making her the center of our universe. Now, let me be clear. I loved Molly when we were kids, but over time I started realizing Molly had this crazy talent for manipulation that nobody else seemed to notice. She could twist any story to her advantage and was a master at playing the victim. One birthday, I got this awesome antique pocket watch from our grandparents. I was thrilled because Grandma said it was a family heirloom, but Molly, being her jealous self, kept pestering me to share it. I said no since it was my birthday gift. She tried to get our parents to make me share, but since it was from our grandparents, they couldn't do much. That night, Molly, knowing I was terrified of spiders, put one in my pillowcase. I woke up with a spider crawling on me and screamed. My parents rushed in, and Molly acted all surprised and caring. Later, she admitted to me with a creepy grin that she did it to teach me a lesson. I was shocked by how casually she confessed without any guilt. Another time, I had a crush on my classmate, Tom, and finally got the guts to invite him over to watch a movie. I was super excited and picked out a nice dress. As soon as Tom arrived, Molly accidentally spilled juice all over my dress and laughed at me. I was mortified and had to change, trying to hide my embarrassment. Then she started telling Tom embarrassing stories about me, making me feel humiliated. She didn't leave us alone the whole time. When Tom was about to leave, she told him he could do better than me. Tom, who had been uncomfortable the whole time, left in a hurry. I couldn't believe how cruel and cunning Molly could be. Over the years, I told my parents about her antics, but they always said she was just young and naive. They couldn't see her for who she was. Whenever I complained, they dismissed me as the troublemaker. So I eventually stopped speaking up. Molly remained their favorite, while I always felt like an outsider in my own family. I focused on my studies, got into a good college, and moved out. But every time I came home, Molly made it clear she hated having me there. She'd ignore me, refuse to talk, and always tried to make my visits miserable. She'd mess with my stuff, pretend to borrow things, and often break or lose them. My parents did nothing and urged us to get along. So I started avoiding home during breaks, making excuses to stay with friends instead. My parents didn't mind and chalked it up to me being independent. When Molly graduated high school, she didn't have the grades for college and went to community college instead, staying at home. Now I work for a multinational company in San Francisco and love my job. I keep in touch with my parents occasionally, but rarely visit home and have no contact with Molly. Now here's the story. My dad had a near-fatal heart attack recently. Thankfully, he survived and was rushed to the hospital. When my mom called, I immediately booked a ticket and flew home. The doctors prescribed a bunch of medications and told him to start working out. Since being discharged, he wanted to spend more time with us and felt lucky to be alive. I understood, so I spent a few days at home. My job allows remote work, so it was no problem. However, Molly was visibly pissed that I was back. I avoided her because we were older now and I didn't want to argue after Dad's heart attack. One morning during breakfast, Dad suggested a family vacation since it had been a while. I had my doubts, but agreed for his sake. Molly wasn't thrilled, but had no choice. Dad made all the arrangements, and I planned my leave from work, telling my colleagues not to contact me. We got to the airport, and that's when things went south. I found out my flight ticket had been canceled. Dad looked confused, insisting he had booked and paid for my ticket. When we checked, out of the 4 tickets, mine was the only one mysteriously canceled. I looked over at Molly, and she had that sly grin on her face, the same look she always had when she pulled one of her dirty tricks. I knew right then and there she had canceled my ticket, probably used Dad's computer or something. I started yelling at her, but she just stood there smiling. I told my parents it was Molly's doing, that she never wanted me on this family vacation. Instead of believing me, Mom immediately dismissed my claim. "Your sister would never do something like that," she said, giving me a cold stare. She went on to tell me to stop being jealous and that it was just a freak accident my ticket got canceled. Dad tried to calm things down, saying it might have been an airline mistake and not to blame Molly. I was beyond frustrated that they couldn't see what was right in front of them. There was nothing I could do. My ticket was canceled, and there were no other flights that day. Sure, I could have flown out the next day, but the idea of traveling alone and then sharing a room with Molly wasn't appealing. I had hoped she'd grown up, but clearly she was still the same manipulative brat. Dad suggested we all go back home and plan a new trip, but then he started talking about how long it had been since he'd had a vacation. Mom agreed, saying I travel a lot for work and wouldn't miss much. Their comments stung. It felt like they were okay with leaving me behind. So, I told them to go ahead without me. They didn't need much convincing and readily agreed. Standing alone at the airport as my family headed off was a punch to the gut. I went back to San Francisco, determined not to let it ruin my time off. I reconnected with old friends, read some books, and turned my break into a solo staycation. My parents would video call me sometimes, showing off how much fun they were having without me. It hurt to see, but it was another reminder of the favoritism that had always existed in our family. A few days into their vacation, I woke up to several missed calls from Mom. I immediately called her back, worried about Dad's health. She picked up, sounding extremely distressed. She told me something troubling had happened. Dad's essential heart medications were disappearing day by day. Given his fragile health, this was a serious issue. They were in a foreign country and unsure if they could get the same meds there. They searched their room but found nothing. Mom went to Molly's room to borrow some sunscreen and found all the missing meds tucked away in her bedside table. It was a chilling revelation. Mom called Dad over, and they found all the meds that had gone missing. I guess this was when the truth finally hit them. Their beloved daughter had been putting Dad's life at risk. Mom's voice shook as she asked if they should confront Molly. I told her not to say anything until they were back home. They needed to gather their thoughts and evidence. I knew Molly would come up with some excuse if confronted now. But something must have happened that night. I got a late-night call from Dad, his voice trembling. He told me Molly was in jail. Apparently, when they confronted her, she threw a massive tantrum, hurling objects and shouting insults. She accused Dad of booking a ticket for me and threatened them, saying she'd make them regret keeping me in their lives. The situation escalated until hotel staff called the police. Molly refused to calm down and insulted the officers, leading to her arrest. Desperate to get back home after Molly's release, my folks tried to reschedule their flight, but their plans got wrecked when they found out their passports and wallets were missing. Turns out Molly had either hidden them or tossed them away. So there they were, stranded in a foreign country with no money and no passports. For the first time, my parents started to see Molly for who she really was. Mom, who always defended Molly, was now begging me to help. They didn't have any money or documentation to fly back. I told them not to worry and that I'd send them money through Western Union, but they had to find their passports first. I was sure Molly hadn't thrown them away. Finally, after hours of searching, they found the passports hidden in Molly's luggage. It hit them hard. Their miracle child had put them in this mess. They finally realized I had been right all along about her antics. They were grateful I was helping them despite everything. They apologized for their behavior. While part of me wanted to forgive them, it was tough to forget the years of favoritism that had deprived me of their love. Am I the bad guy for not forgiving my parents for going on this vacation without me? And now, after getting a taste of Molly's true colors, coming back begging for forgiveness? Every day they called me with updates, and I grew increasingly anxious about their situation. After Molly was released from jail, they threatened her to give back the passports, or they'd call the authorities again. Faced with no choice, Molly finally revealed where she hid them. When they got home, they told Molly she needed to pack up and leave. It was clear they had reached their breaking point, finally seeing how harmful and manipulative she was. This kicked off another screaming match. Molly started hurling accusations at my parents, saying she didn't want to share them with anyone and that inviting me on the trip pushed her over the edge. She kept insisting they should disown me, saying she was enough for them. My parents must have realized just how deep her jealousy ran and how much she resented me. They tried to calm her down, but she kept yelling. In a fit of rage, she threatened to tell everyone that they neglected and mistreated her as a child. Molly even threatened to go to the police with false claims if they kept asking her to move out. This scared my parents, especially since they're respected doctors in our community. The idea of their reputation being ruined by false accusations left them feeling trapped. In the days that followed, Molly made their lives even more difficult. When she found out they were talking to me regularly, she got mad and started breaking dishes. She kept stealing their car keys, making it hard for them to go to work. Just tonight, Mom called me in tears. Molly had thrown a tantrum at dinner, demanding Mom cook for her. When Mom refused because she was exhausted from work, Molly went on a rampage, breaking furniture and blasting music so loud they couldn't sleep. The situation was spiraling out of control, taking a toll on my parents' emotional and mental health. I was seriously worried about what might happen next. While I had hoped they'd see Molly's true nature, I never expected things to get this bad. I couldn't go home because it might trigger Molly even more. I urged my parents to talk to a lawyer to find a permanent solution. The legal route seemed like the only way to protect them and restore peace to our family. Then it happened. Molly got herself arrested again. As many of you predicted, with Molly's antics spiraling out of control, it was bound to happen. One night, during a heated argument, she grabbed a knife and came at my parents. This terrified them, and they had no choice but to call the cops. The officers took her into custody for assault. With Molly locked up, my parents decided it was time to take more permanent action. They consulted with a lawyer about evicting her from the house. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for their safety. They filed a formal eviction notice. They knew it would be tough, but they had to make their home safe again. My parents didn't want to press charges. They just wanted her out. They bailed her out of jail and handed her the notice, explaining why she had to go and when she needed to leave. My folks made sure everything was done by the book so Molly couldn't fight it. Next, they went to court with their lawyer to start the eviction process. It meant suing Molly, which was incredibly hard on them. Taking their own daughter to court made them feel sad and guilty, but they felt they had no other choice. The court issued an order that Molly had to leave the house. If she didn't go on her own, they had the legal right to force her out. Molly is supposed to be out by next week. My parents can finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing they've taken a step towards reclaiming their home and peace. It's been a tough road, but they hope things will get better once Molly moves out. Throughout this ordeal, I've stayed in touch and planned to bring them to San Francisco for a few weeks. They need a break after all they've been through. I'm sure a change of scenery and some time away from the stress will do them good. Plus, it'll give us a chance to spend some quality time together. I want to support them as much as I can. I've received tons of comments on my post, and it's taken a while to go through them all. Many of you suggested we get Molly checked for mental health issues. The problem is, since she's an adult, we can't force her to get evaluated against her will. With her sudden violent outbursts, we don't want to push her and complicate things even more. As I mentioned before, my parents flew down to San Francisco to spend some time with me. They needed a break after the last few months of chaos. Yesterday evening, we sat around the dining table in my apartment, and my parents started opening up. Their voices were filled with regret. They admitted they had been blind to Molly's true nature all these years and begged for my forgiveness. Dad expressed deep remorse for not listening to me earlier. He said they never expected Molly to turn out this way and couldn't see the truth beneath her charming facade. Mom, in a rare moment of honesty, echoed Dad's sentiments. She acknowledged how wrong they were to dismiss my concerns about Molly. Her voice trembled with pain as she realized how they had failed me by favoring Molly. I appreciated their apology. I shared some painful memories of the years of torment I endured because of Molly. My parents were shocked and dismayed at the extent of my suffering. They realized how their favoritism clouded their judgment. They begged for my forgiveness for all those years of neglect. It was bittersweet. I had always wanted their acknowledgement, but it was still hard to accept. While it wasn't the ideal way to mend our relationship, it brought much-needed honesty and clarity to our family dynamic. For the first time in years, we were addressing the real issues that plagued our family. I told them it would take time to trust them again, and we all agreed to work through this together. As the days went by, my parents and I spent more time together, wandering around the vibrant streets of San Francisco, enjoying meals at local diners, and just soaking up each other's company. It was a journey to reconnect and rebuild the bonds that had been strained by years of favoritism and denial. Their decision to come to me wasn't just about getting away from Molly, but about rebuilding the family they had almost lost. We all needed a fresh start, and so did I. My parents and I discussed what to do with Molly. She was staying at a friend's house, but we couldn't just abandon her despite all the chaos she'd caused. As parents, they felt a deep sense of responsibility towards her, even though her actions were unforgivable. We came to terms with the fact that Molly's behavior might not just be willful mischief, but could indicate deeper issues. We decided to explore the possibility of a mental health evaluation to understand her better. However, since Molly's an adult, we can't force her to get assessed. We had to find a way to encourage her to seek help voluntarily. My parents planned to reach out to Molly once they were back home to see if she was open to a discussion. I didn't want to contact her myself because she still held a strong grudge against me, and I didn't want to make things worse. Considering her past violent outbursts, I advised my parents to meet her in a public place so she'd be less likely to lose control. Our main goal was for Molly to understand our perspective and, most importantly, recognize the deep love and concern we had for her. It wasn't about blaming her, but about coming together as a family to address the issues straining our relationships. Despite everything, my parents were hopeful. They believed that with the right help, Molly could change. I was more skeptical, given all that had happened, but I wanted to support my parents. They'd finally seen the truth and were trying to make things right. For now, we focused on making the most of our time together. It was the first step in a long journey of healing. When my parents eventually returned home, they reached out to Molly. She agreed to meet them at a CAF GC. I stayed in touch with them throughout, anxiously waiting for updates. They told her how much they loved her and that they wanted to help. At first, she was defensive, but eventually she broke down. She admitted she felt abandoned when they invited me on the trip and didn't know how to handle it. My parents listened, offering support, but also making it clear that her behavior was unacceptable and needed to change. Molly agreed to see a therapist. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. My parents arranged for her to stay with a relative while she got the help she needed. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. They were relieved, and so was I. It felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. Back in San Francisco, I continued to focus on my job and rebuilding my life. The experience had been draining, but it also brought a sense of closure. My parents and I were on the path to healing our relationship. It would take time, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future. Once my folks got back home, they reached out to Molly and set up a meeting at a local CAF GC. They filled me in on the details as I anxiously waited for updates. They told her how much they loved her and wanted to help. At first, she was defensive, spewing her usual venom. "You never really cared about me. You always preferred Jake," she shouted. Mom, in her typical bitchy tone, snapped back, "Oh, stop with the theatrics, Molly. We've always done everything for you." It was clear Molly was used to manipulating the situation, but this time my parents were prepared. Dad, trying to stay calm, said, "Molly, we just want you to get the help you need." After what felt like an eternity, Molly finally broke down. She admitted feeling abandoned and didn't know how to handle it when they invited me on the trip. My parents listened, offering support but also making it clear her behavior was unacceptable and needed to change. Molly reluctantly agreed to see a therapist. It was a small victory, but crucial. They arranged for her to stay with a relative while she got the help she needed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. They were relieved, and so was I. It felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. Back in San Francisco, I focused on my job and tried to rebuild my life. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, but it also brought a sense of closure. My parents and I were on the path to healing our relationship. It would take time, but for the first time in years I felt hopeful about the future. One evening, as I was settling into my routine, my phone rang. It was Mom. Her voice, sharp as ever, carried a mix of frustration and resignation. "Jake, you won't believe what Molly did today," she started. Turns out Molly had another meltdown at her relative's house, screaming and throwing things. "We just can't catch a break with her," Mom spat out, clearly fed up. "She needs time, Mom," I replied, trying to be the voice of reason. "Therapy isn't an overnight fix." Mom sighed. "I know, but it's just so hard. Your dad and I are at our wits' end." I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. They'd been through the ringer, and it wasn't over yet. Despite the setbacks, we all held on to the sliver of hope that Molly could change. Therapy sessions began, and slowly, reports from the therapist were cautiously optimistic. Molly had a long road ahead, but at least she was on it. My parents and I continued to rebuild our relationship, each phone call and visit mending the broken trust bit by bit. I visited home for the holidays, a bit anxious about seeing Molly. The tension was palpable, but there was also an air of determination. We were all trying. Molly was quieter, more subdued. The therapy seemed to be having an effect, though it was clear she still had a lot of work to do. During Christmas dinner, an awkward silence fell over the table. Molly finally spoke up. "I'm sorry for everything, Jake. I know I've been difficult." It wasn't a full apology, but it was a start. "Thanks, Molly. Let's just take it one day at a time," I replied, offering a small smile. After dinner, Dad pulled me aside. "It's going to take a lot more time, but I think we're getting there," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the past few months. "We just need to keep moving forward." As I drove back to San Francisco after the holidays, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a touch of skepticism. It hadn't been easy, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like we were a family trying to heal, rather than one being torn apart. After the holidays, life started to return to some semblance of normalcy. I was back in San Francisco, diving into work and trying to keep myself busy, but the whole situation with Molly and my parents was always at the back of my mind. Mom would call almost every day, her sharp tone making it clear she was still on edge. "Jake, you need to come home more often. Your sister is still a mess, and we could use your help," she'd say, not so much asking as demanding. I'd try to keep the peace. "Mom, I've got my own life here, you know. I'm doing what I can," I'd reply, but it never seemed to be enough for her. She'd huff and puff, and then we'd move on to the next topic. Molly's therapy was ongoing, and while there were small signs of progress, there were also setbacks. One evening, Mom called in a fury. "Jake, you wouldn't believe what Molly did today. She screamed at your dad because he wouldn't let her borrow the car. She called him all sorts of names. It was a nightmare." I could practically see Mom's face turning red with anger. "Mom, she's got issues that aren't going to be fixed overnight. You've got to be patient," I said, trying to calm her down. But patience was never Mom's strong suit. Dad was handling it a bit better, though I could tell it was taking a toll on him too. He'd call sometimes, his voice weary but steady. "We're doing our best, Jake. It's just hard. Every day feels like a battle." In the midst of all this, I tried to find moments of peace for myself. I'd go for long walks, losing myself in the sights and sounds of the city. I'd meet up with friends, go to baseball games, anything to keep my mind off the chaos back home, but it was never far away. One weekend, I decided to surprise my parents with a visit. When I walked into the house, I could feel the tension in the air. Molly was in the living room, sulking as usual. Mom was in the kitchen, banging pots and pans around. Dad was in his study, probably trying to find a moment of quiet. "Hey, everyone, I'm home," I called out, trying to sound cheerful. Mom barely looked up. "Oh, it's you," she said, her tone as cold as ice. "Just what we needed, another person to add to the madness." Molly rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Dad came out of his study looking tired but smiling. "Good to see you, Jake. How's life in the city?" he asked, giving me a quick hug. We sat down for dinner, and it was as awkward as ever. Mom kept making snide comments about how I never visited enough, how I didn't understand what they were going through. Molly was quiet, picking at her food. Dad tried to keep the conversation light, but it was clear he was struggling. After dinner, Dad and I went out to the porch to talk. "It's tough, Jake. Your mom's at her breaking point, and Molly, well, she's still Molly. But having you here helps," he said, looking out into the distance. "I know, Dad. I'm trying. It's just hard being caught in the middle of all this," I replied, feeling the weight of it all. We sat there in silence for a while, just enjoying the rare moment of peace. The next day I took Molly out for a drive. We didn't talk much, just drove around the countryside, the silence between us heavy but somehow comforting. Eventually she spoke up. "I know I've been a pain, Jake. I'm trying to get better, really," she said, her voice small and vulnerable. "I know, Molly. Just take it one day at a time." "We're all here for you," I replied, hoping my words would sink in. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When I left to go back to San Francisco, things felt a little better. There was still a long road ahead, but it felt like we were moving in the right direction. For the first time in a while, I felt a glimmer of hope for our family. After my visit, things seemed to stabilize a bit. Molly kept up with her therapy, and the tension at home was a tad less suffocating. But it was far from over. Back in San Francisco, I was getting into my routine, but the calls from Mom never stopped. "Jake, you really should come home more often. It's not fair that we're dealing with this on our own," she'd complain, her voice always laced with that sharp edge. One evening, as I was unwinding with a beer and some football on TV, Mom called. "Jake, you won't believe what your sister did today. She had another meltdown, and this time she broke Dad's favorite watch, the one he got from his father." She practically yelled into the phone. "Mom, I get it, but you know she's struggling. Breaking things isn't right, but she's not doing it to be mean." I tried to reason with her, but I knew it was futile. "It's easy for you to say, sitting there in San Francisco. We're the ones dealing with the mess," she snapped back. I sighed, knowing this conversation was going nowhere. A few weeks later, I decided to visit home again. As soon as I walked in, the atmosphere was thick with unresolved tension. Molly was in her room blasting music. Mom was in the kitchen, her face twisted in frustration as she aggressively chopped vegetables. Dad was nowhere to be seen. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, look who decided to show up," she said without looking up. "I suppose you'll be leaving just as quickly, too." Ignoring her jab, I went to find Dad. He was in the garage, tinkering with the car. "Hey, Dad," I said, sitting down on a stool. "Hey, Jake, it's good to see you," he said, giving me a tired smile. "It's been rough. Molly's trying, but it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back." "I get it, Dad. I'm here now, so let's try to make the best of it," I said, hoping to lift his spirits a bit. Dinner that night was another awkward affair. Mom's sharp comments and Molly's sulking made it clear that things hadn't improved much. After dinner, Dad and I sat on the porch again. "I don't know how much more your mother can take, Jake. She's at her wit's end," Dad said, staring into the night. "I know, Dad. But we can't give up on Molly. She needs us now more than ever," I replied, feeling the weight of responsibility. The next day I took Molly for a drive again. We drove in silence for a while before she finally spoke. "I feel like I'm always screwing up, Jake. No matter what I do, it's never enough," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's a tough road, Molly, but you have to keep trying. We're all here for you, even if it doesn't always feel like it," I said, trying to be the supportive brother she needed. When I returned to San Francisco, I felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief that I was away from the constant tension, and guilt for not being able to do more. Work was my escape, but the calls from Mom kept coming, each one a reminder of the chaos back home. One evening, Dad called instead. "Jake, I think it's time we looked into a more permanent solution. Your mother can't take much more, and Molly's not getting any better here," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "What are you thinking, Dad?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I've been researching some residential treatment centers, places where she can get the help she needs around the clock," he replied. It was a hard pill to swallow, but I knew he was right. "All right, Dad, let's look into it together. We'll find the best place for her," I said, feeling the weight of the decision. Over the next few weeks, we researched and visited several treatment centers. It was tough, but we knew it was the best option. Molly needed more help than we could give her at home. Finally, we found a place that felt right. It was a residential treatment center with a good reputation and a compassionate staff. Convincing Molly was another battle. "You just want to get rid of me," she screamed when we told her. "Molly, we want to help you. This is the best way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. After a lot of tears and arguments, she finally agreed. The day we dropped her off was one of the hardest days of my life. Watching her walk away, looking so vulnerable, broke my heart. But I knew it was the right decision. Dropping Molly off at the treatment center was tough, but we knew it was the right thing to do. The drive back home was silent, the weight of what we'd just done hanging heavy in the air. Mom was in one of her moods, snapping at Dad for every little thing. "You could have driven slower, you know. It's not like we're in a hurry," she barked. Dad sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "I'm just trying to get us home, Claire. Let's not argue right now." I stayed quiet in the back seat, thinking about Molly. I hoped she would get the help she needed, and that this would be a turning point for all of us. Once we got home, the house felt emptier than ever. Mom went straight to the kitchen, banging pots and pans around. "I need to cook. It's the only thing that keeps me sane," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. Dad disappeared into his study, probably to bury himself in work or anything that could distract him from the silence. I stayed for a few more days, helping out where I could, but it was clear that things were still tense. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Mom finally spoke up. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, Jake. Your father and I are exhausted." I looked at her, seeing the strain etched into her face. "I know, Mom, but Molly's in the best place for her right now. We just have to give it time." Mom huffed. "Time, huh? We've given her plenty of that already." Her tone was sharp, but I knew she was just venting her frustration. When I finally headed back to San Francisco, I felt a mix of relief and guilt again. The tension at home was suffocating, but I couldn't just abandon my parents. I called them every day, checking in on how things were going. They'd visit Molly at the treatment center regularly, and the updates were cautiously optimistic. Molly was participating in her sessions and seemed to be making progress, albeit slowly. A few months passed, and there were still ups and downs. Mom was her usual self, snapping at Dad over trivial things, but there were moments when she seemed softer, more hopeful. Dad remained the steady anchor, always trying to keep things calm. Then one day I got a call from Molly herself. "Jake, it's me," she said, her voice sounding stronger than it had in a long time. "I wanted to thank you for everything. I know I've been a nightmare, but I'm really trying to get better." Hearing that brought a lump to my throat. "I'm proud of you, Molly. Just keep working hard. We're all here for you," I replied, my voice shaky with emotion. Over the next few months, Molly continued to improve. She completed her treatment and moved into a halfway house to help transition back into normal life. My parents and I supported her every step of the way. It wasn't easy, but we were all committed to making it work. The holidays came around again, and this time things felt different. We gathered at home, and there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. Molly was quieter, more reflective, but also more at ease. We all were. At Christmas dinner, Mom raised her glass. "To family," she said, her voice softer than usual. "We've been through a lot, but we're still here. Let's keep moving forward together." We all clinked glasses, and for the first time in years I felt a genuine sense of hope. It hadn't been an easy journey, and we still had a long way to go. But we were finally on the right path, and that made all the difference. As I drove back to San Francisco after the holidays, I felt lighter. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew we could handle whatever came our way. We were a family, flawed and imperfect, but strong enough to face the future together.